Welcome back to Troubleshooting Agile, and welcome back, Jeffrey, from CITCON.
Thanks, Squirrel. It's good to be back, and not just from KickOn, but from 5.5 weeks in Europe. Which, man, that was a long
Wow.
trip.
You're always welcome back, Jeffrey. Move back anytime you want. But we were both at KitCon and had a blast there, and listeners may have heard our recording there. But Jeffrey, I'm wondering, what was your favorite session?
Well, the weird thing is I could actually have two answers for this. There's the favorite session I attended, but actually, there was also a favorite session that I didn't attend. There was a topic that came up, and when I heard it, I thought, wow, I definitely want to attend that. But then it conflicted with what turned out to be my favorite session that I attended. But I discovered something funny, which would have made me change my behavior. I would have been sure to attend the session, why shift right is a great approach for testing. And of course, like the whole move of Agile has been, and DevOps has been shifting left. And now someone's saying, no, we should shift right for testing. And I just think that's so obviously true that I didn't bother attending. And then I found out later that apparently they meant this sarcastically when they approached it. If they had said they were sarcastic, I definitely would have attended. But good news is I think you actually did attend it.
I did attend, and so I can fill in listeners a little bit. Some folks might not know this shift right, shift left terminology, and then I'll say more about the session that Timo ran, which was fascinating because we're roughly split on who thought Timo was serious and who thought he was joking. So the notion of shift left came up, I think, from one of the DevOps writers, could be Gene Kim or Patrick Dubois or somebody smart like that, came up with the idea that if you do certain things in your development process earlier, rather than waiting till the end, you will get a better result. And the most obvious one of those is getting feedback from users. If you start doing something and 6 months later is the first time when you show it to a user, you will be extremely sad because whatever it is you did, whatever it is you thought you understood, you will not have a correct understanding, and you will find out things from people who care. And so that seems pretty obvious that in that way, shifting activities to the left is a good idea. And of course, something that I teach people to do all the time is elephant carpaccio, deliver every day and get feedback every single day. It may be a tiny bit of feedback. It may be on something that's really not ready, but you find it out immediately. So as soon as you go off track, you find out. And so the kind of classic thing to say is we're always trying to shift left. Well, Timo came along and nobody really quite understood him. He said, maybe it would be a great idea if we did the testing even later. And what he meant was if we did the testing in production, i.e., we've built the whole piece of software, we haven't necessarily done all the kinds of testing we'd like to, and we put the software live and we see whether it works. And I think that's a brilliant idea, although Timo was saying, in my company, that's what we do, and I think it's terrible. So he had his tongue firmly in his cheek, but we couldn't see his tongue.
Yeah, that's right.
There's a lesson in there about understanding sarcasm and understanding what people actually mean and the need for explicitness. But then in the actual session, he started talking about it with his tongue in his cheek, and people like me got more and more confused until at the end, first of all, a bunch of people had left. We have the law of 2 feet, so a bunch of people said, "We don't understand what's going on." They left, and they went to maybe went to your session, Jeffrey. I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
there was only a few of us left, and I said, "Timo, I think I finally understand. You don't want to shift to the right." He said, "No, no, no. It's just a joke. I just was being provocative. I wanted people to come and tell me how I could actually convince my company that we should do the testing earlier." And I said, well, we should do the testing later. It's a great idea to do at least some of the testing at the end in production.
Yes.
And that really blew a few minds. So, Jeffrey, I wonder does that match up with what you were thinking?
That's really funny to hear that whole story. Um, uh, uh, but I think, yeah, the question here about shifting right, and the one thing here is you say like we should do some of the testing in production. I've this has been a topic for me for many years, actually, predating AI. I do think there's some things about AI that make testing in production more important than it has been previously, but I actually think it's been important for a long time. And one of the key ideas here that you're using is some. Um, now, which also interesting, I'll just say that the idea of like it's better to catch defects earlier is a very old idea. I mean, certainly in the 90s at the latest, there was very well established literature talking about the cost savings that came if you detected problems earlier. And it kind of the rule of thumb was an order of magnitude more expensive at every later stage that you catch a problem. So a problem in requirements is much more expensive than if you catch it in the coding stage, right? So you better catch it in requirements before you even start writing. If you catch it when you start a defect in coding, then it's cheaper to catch it there than if you catch it later in testing, and then it's better to catch in testing than in production, and have to do production bug fix. The old calculus was that each of these added order of magnitude. That was part of what drove the agile approach of what you described, the elephant carpaccio. Like, well, if we make these slices as small as possible, then it may still be an order of magnitude more expensive, but we're talking about the difference between, minutes and hours rather than weeks and years, kind of thing. So,
And if we do it frequently, we'll catch it earlier in the whole project, and therefore we won't have a whole bunch of things built on top of whatever it is that's wrong. We'll find out that we're headed the wrong direction to start with. I remember one case where we were building something for a bank, and a year in, we found out that they needed an accounting portion of the platform. We thought they were doing the accounting. They thought we were doing the accounting.
oh no.
Nobody was doing any credits or debits. It doesn't work well in a bank. I would have
Oh,
liked to know that on day one and not day 365.
that's right. Oh goodness. Yes, that's a pretty extreme example. Um,
But that doesn't mean that there's this tremendous cost today. And Jeffrey, you point to one thing, which is AI. Another is we don't have to burn CDs anymore. And you and
yeah,
I remember the 1990s. Some of our listeners weren't even born then. But when you actually got done with the software, you had to put it on a CD and put it in the post and stick a stamp on it.
oh
And
yeah.
we don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I remember getting a box of software which came with these
Hmm.
printed manuals and
Oh, yeah.
27 floppy disks. The whole thing weighed 31 pounds. So that's pretty,
Sounds about right.
a very different physical reality than today. And exactly as you say, like the cost
And a much
of,
higher cost.
yeah, exactly. That's right. The cost of change for that was very high. Now, one thing that happened, though, I'll say is like so with a good change of attention, saying let's make sure we have better testing earlier. Which one of the most obvious things was like having developers test their code before it goes to QA. That was one of the major shifts in shifting left. But still, I would often find places where people had done a bunch of testing, but then were relatively light on their ability to learn about problems in production. And so there was kind of this mismatch where, for the things that they had considered, they had a very good suite of tests, but they had very poor monitoring of actual behavior in the production system. And that's one of the things that I've been talking about for a few years, and I would sometimes call it monitoring driven development, that you should be running your monitoring earlier. Um, and I do think that something with AI, it does change the calculus a bit, where it becomes more and more important to have better testing in production, which is a combination of observability and metrics and monitoring and some traces and things like that. Because if we're going to be increasing the volume of code going to production, even if the quality level stays the same and we're going to have more of it, there's probably more edge cases out there that we haven't caught, just even if it's the same percentage. And it would be good for us to have better visibility in what we're doing to make sure that we are able to find those problems that are occurring in production, because that's where it really matters is what's happening in production.
And of course, if we're going to hand one of the things that failed in production to an AI, it would be great if we had lots and lots of logging and monitoring and information, because the AI doesn't care how much you send to it. Maybe its tokens are starting to cost a bit more, so that calculus might change. But at least at the moment, it's practically free to give it 27 pages or 200 megabytes of logs or something like that, and say, go find the error. And it says,
Yeah.
aha, here on line 5,937, that's where the problem is, and gives you a proposed fix. You better still look at that fix and make sure it's right, but the AI is much quicker at that than the average junior developer or intern, who is the sort of person that we would send to the logs before that, as Jeffrey and I both remember. And the interesting thing about that is that lots of people have been doing this for quite some time for a portion of their testing. And certainly Jeffrey and I aren't saying skip all your tests, don't write any tests, and then just test everything in production and hope your users don't get angry with you. That's probably not going to work very well, even if you're in an error-friendly environment like an e-commerce website. If you're building a nuclear plant, you definitely shouldn't do that. But Etsy, for many, many years, when I visited them many years ago, they showed me this room. They have a room in which they keep the testing objects, the things they've bought, because they have a credit card whose only purpose in life is to be hooked up to a recurring task, a repeating task, and the task once an hour buys a real thing from a real creator on Etsy. They make handmade sweaters and toys and whatever, and it just picks one at random and it buys one. And it actually gets shipped to the Etsy office and it's put in this room. And then when the room fills up, they bring a charity over to take it and do good things with it.
Okay.
But the reason they do that is because real credit cards and real creators and real systems are completely different from test systems. And they got burnt enough times that they said, we want to actually test this really works. And it's worth some money to us. Now, Etsy items are not super expensive, so this isn't a multi-million-dollar program. But it is certainly a valuable thing which verifies all day, every day, that Etsy's many hundreds of developers have not broken something that causes no one to be able to buy on Etsy, which would kind of be bad. And that's a form of testing that happens in production. It's shifted as far right as you possibly can, and it verifies that sort of the ground truth is there, that the major thing that the company does that makes it money, which is sell stuff, can still happen. And that's the kind of thing I then proposed at the end of Timo's session once I figured out he was joking. And I said, actually, Timo, it would be good if you did that kind of testing all the way at the right, because you can do it at the left, but you can't simulate the real world nearly as well as the real world can simulate the real world.
That's right. There's another thing that happens, which if you think about, we want to be able to verify in production. If you make this mindset shift where you're like, actually, we do care about testing that, and you start saying, well, then how would we do that? What are all the things that we could be capturing? And you build out the systems to capture that information in production. After you've done that, what you can do next is move some of that stuff left. You can take a lot of those components, not all of them. You're not going to do the credit card transaction buying a real object from production. You can't do that earlier than production. But there's a lot of parts of the system that you can be measuring in your test environments and move earlier. But my experience is that people don't build those things unless they actually have that production driver. So then it turns out when people haven't built those things, then they don't have the visibility in production. When they go build that visibility in production, it gives them more tools for their earlier testing. And that ends up bringing a lot of benefits. And the other thing that happens is these systems you have for testing in production can be quite complicated. And so one of the questions is, how do you test that your tests are working? This actually, in the very early days for me working in XP, one of the things that we found very useful was the idea of how do we know our test is correct? One of the things that you do in TDD, the TDD game, is you say, look, we need to be red, green, refactor. And we need to have the failing test before we have can say that the code works. And that's to prove that your test is actually, it can fail. Good tests fail because it's quite possible to make errors in your testing logic the same way it is in your coding logic. That is true when you get to these systems in production and testing the systems in production. So having the ability to test your testing of production, man, is this getting a little bit complicated? Having the ability to validate that those pieces you're using to test production work is actually super valuable and part of the whole calculus. But what I find is that people only get there if they are seriously considering how do we detect problems in production, which is something that usually is slightly anemic for people because they've invested so much in shifting left that they forget about the right.
There you go. All right, lots in there. Just to help out listeners who might not know, XP is extreme programming. It's a software development methodology, and TDD is test-driven development. So a method of creating the tests way at the left, even before or during the time when you're creating the code. So that's a super shifted left mechanism. But Jeffrey, you and I have both worked in systems that are event-driven or event sourcing. And those systems, and often in finance, are really great for the exact kind of left shifting that you're describing. And they're just one example, because they produce a series of events like I'm going to buy this share and then sell half as many of those shares, and then I'm going to short this stock, and so on. A whole bunch of different financial events, for example, happen. And you can replay those. So you can easily replay those in your tests. So you can get the thing that actually failed and pull out the sequence of events that caused it. And then because you caught that in production, you noticed that you'd sold when you meant to buy, which is a pretty common and pretty nasty error in financial transactions. You can put that into your tests way at the left so that that never happens again in that specific scenario. And of course, you build up a library of those over time. But shifting right in order to shift left is a thing that didn't come up in the session, but it should have. So I'm glad you brought it up here, Jeffrey.
Yep, absolutely. And one thing I'll just want to kind of close with here is this is an example of something which I think has been an overall theme in any discussion I've had with people about AI, which is this is something that has been true and valuable for a very long period of time. And what's changing, it seems to be, is that now that AI is coming, people feel like they need to be changing what they do, and they're now seem to be willing to do things, quote unquote, for AI that would have been valuable before, but they seem to be not willing to do it for just us as mere humans. But now that AI needs it, I think that makes it more likely. So I think that's something that our audience can lean into if they want to argue for this, is that while this is always what we're seeing, this has always been valuable to do, it's going to be much closer to essential with AI driven development, which if you believe the idea that it's going to be have a lot more volume of code reaching production.
I'll take it either way, as long as we get really good tests, both in production that tell us when something has slipped through and gone wrong, and as early as possible while we're releasing every day and getting really rapid feedback from customers. If I've got to say that's for the AI, I will say it all day long, Jeffrey. I'd be perfectly happy to do that. Good stuff.
Right.
So if our listeners, now some of our listeners might be AIs. I'm not actually kidding about that. There are people running AIs that are sort of autonomous. There was one that wrote a nasty blog post about someone who didn't accept his changes to an open source piece of software. So some of our listeners might be AIs, and they might tell us what they'd like to hear about and what kind of tests they'd like to see. If you're a human listener, we'd also like to hear from you. And, if you disagree with us and you think shift left is the only thing to do and we're all wet about testing in production, we really like it, especially when people disagree with us. So whether you're silicon or carbon, the way to get in touch with us is to go to agileconversations.com, and that's where you'll find our book, Agile Conversations, and material that's all free, videos and guides to running a conversational dojo and a whole bunch of other free good stuff. And of course, our email and Instagram, and I think we're on the claw thing that the AIs have set up. I have no idea, but there's all kinds of different ways to get in touch, and we'd really like to hear from you by any means, because it always makes us happy and gives us new material when we hear from our listeners. Of course, the other way to keep in touch is to come back again next week when we'll have another edition of Troubleshooting Agile. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Squirrel.